Okay, so this presentation goes over how to create plugins and themes that can be extended with other plugins. Of course, with themes, you can extend them with child themes, so that's not going to be part of this presentation. But just simply going in different methods of creating extension points in your plugins and themes so that other developers that use your plugins and themes can go in and um, uh, replace functionality or implement their own functionality. So this slide isn't quite well. I mean, if you have any questions, ask in the comment. I'll just make a comment, and I will attempt to answer it. So the motivation of this is that back in 2006, 2007, I was using a plugin at work that was just a big giant class. All the methods, all the attributes and properties were part of this class, and at the bottom, the only thing it did was simply say new object name. So ultimately, what I had to do was just simply extend the class and replace the methods that I needed to replace. This sort of goes into how that could have been improved to where I wouldn't have to extend that class. It's just you want to make it as easy as possible for other people to potentially implement and do certain things, and creating extension points allows that. Extension points are um, well, points in your code where someone can go in and extend it. And this is not quite the same as having a class and having um, extend extending it with a child class. So the reason why you want to use extension points as opposed to just creating a class and then extending it with a your child class is because you want to get away from having child classes. You want to get away from extending classes, and extension points sort of allows you to create independent objects that can be used together as well as used in different configurations. So if I want to reuse a class, I could do so if there's an extension point, as well as if that extension point allows for that class to be used in multiple places. And that's a bit more complex than what I'm going to go into. But that's sort of the reason why you want to go away from having to extend. Having to extend is sort of a indication that the code that you created is not that good. So you just simply want to have as many extension points as possible. And this presentation is only going to go into two. And the first part is going to be the plugin API, as well as extension using interfaces and sort of go into code as well. So the WordPress has many extension points in the functions and in classes, and it does this by apply filters, and a little bit later I'm going to go into do action. So these allow you to create hooks, allow hooks to execute code and modify, in the case of apply filters, the content. And so you don't have to create some hook or extend an object to modify the content. You just simply apply a hook to the add filter, and when apply filters executes that hook, it will modify that content through your hook, which is pretty neat. So going into the original plugin, this presentation is based off of a presentation that was given prior. So a lot of the code um, might not make sense if you're watching the YouTube. I will have a link to the plugin that I'm extending or modifying in this case below, so that you may check it out, and have a link to the presentation code so you can check that out as well, which is simply a fork of the GitHub repository of the original plugin. So this function that exists in the original plugin didn't have apply filters. So I added the apply filters to the add meta box, gave it a hook name, my underscore mb dash meta dash box dash title, as well as have localized title for the meta box. So a plugin can come in and say add filter my underscore mb dash meta dash box dash title, and either modify the existing title or replace the title altogether. So they don't have to actually come into this function and change whatever the title is. Of course, they could change it as well as also by adding their localization. That's a bit more difficult because that is global to WordPress at the moment. So this is a brief, a trivial example. So it doesn't really, I mean, it's not that useful, but you sort of want to do this as much as possible in as many places as possible, so that plugin authors can do what they want. So they don't have to request, hey, can you apply filter here or do action there? It's just there as many places as possible. And the nice thing about using extension points in your plugin yourself is that you can create additional plugins that change functionality for clients and for different purposes. So you don't have to throw everything into one plugin. You can have one plugin that's a base, and then have plugins that extend the original. So this allows you to sort of separate and better test the original plugin as well as the other plugins that you develop off of that base plugin. So a second plugin is an example of someone who potentially could come in, create their own plugin, and say, well, I don't want the original plugin title. I want to rename it YouTube embed code. And then I also localized it with the add filter. So this is how you would replace the content, and it's very simple. I mean, the plugin API is in and of itself, using it and in both apply filters and your plugin. It's very simple. It's very straightforward because there's a lot of examples and tutorials online for how to use the plugin API. WordPress is built on the plugin API, so everything you would do is the plugin API. So applying filters as well as adding new action to your plugin is not something that is commonly done in plugins, from what I can see. But it should be, because just because Core does it doesn't mean you can't do it yourself. You should do it, which is what the presentation goes over, and how you would potentially do it as well. So I don't really go into much theme, but yeah, if you want you can call the same function apply filters in your theme. This is a very trivial, basic example. Doesn't quite get into the power of apply filters and do action. So the purpose is to sort of show how you would do it. So it's just simply, as opposed to calling a function or built into the theme, you would just simply say apply filters and then apply that function to the add that filter to or action to that hook, so that other people can go in and change that functionality. So if I wanted to, I can come and in a plugin, say write this code, and then I'm done. So I take the content, add something, add else, which is localized. Unfortunately, localization with this is might not make sense. It might be better if something else, potentially in a different language, that would require possibly a switch or another word. So it's not going to work as well localized like that. Well, it's just an example. So potentially, if that is the case, you can simply replace the original content. So something of note is that the one in the apply filter is necessary. I believe by default it will. What this does is simply cut or split the arguments. So if there's 3 arguments passed to the hook, it will only pass 1 to you, and that's by default. So if you want all 3, you would have to say change this to a 3. If you want 2, change it to 2, so on and so forth. That way you get all the arguments, or as many arguments as you need. So the apply filters, as I said before, allows you to modify content. It's an extension point that allows you to modify content, which is really great because they don't have to go in and modify the code in your theme or plugin. So the problem with modifying your plugin and theme is that when it updates, it removes that modifications if it automatically updates. And even if it doesn't, they have to go in and re-add those modifications. So it's just better to add extension points so that you don't have to change the code in the original form unless you are the original author and have that version. Do action executes an action. And you can add your hook using add action. So the original plugin is I took the my MB save and I modified it to, instead of having the update code and the delete code part of the if else, I split that out into separate functions and added it to the hook instead. Again, this is not quite something. This is not something you would do potentially in your plugin. Sorry. So the example is to show how simple it is, or what you could do in your plugin. And in this case, I decided to have 2 separate hooks that can be executed, and the functions can be very specific. So when do action my underscore MB dash update dash post dash meta is executed, I know that the validation and the verification has already been done, and I know that I'm supposed to update. There's no checking that needs to be done in that hook. When that hook runs, you know immediately that the only thing they're supposed to do is update, as well as the delete. And the add action below also, again, it has the 3, so it takes all 3 arguments as an example of what I was talking about prior. And this update function callback to the my underscore dash update dash post dash meta hook. This is an example. So it is more code, but it's more pretty. So anyone can go in, and if they extend this plugin, they can also hook in to the update process and do their own tasks. So if they need to send an email or do some cleanup task, they can do it in this hook without having to modify this function. They can just add their own function, and that's the power of the plugin API, as well as an example of a delete. So if you go back and forth, this takes 3, so the a 3 is there to show that this takes 3 arguments, and the 2 is there to show that this takes 2 arguments. So yeah, I mean, the second plugin would could further extend the code and do whatever, as well as themes. So themes can call do action and should call do action. And usually they do that like when comments are being displayed or in between sections. So if there's a post, they might call do action to say this is before post, and call a do action after the post, so that plugins can inject content at those points. This is opposed to having a filter that modifies the original post content, forcing plugin authors to modify the original post content, which they may not want to do. So the plugin API is very elegant in its simplicity. It's very simple, very powerful, and there's no reason not to use it. The second part goes into object-oriented programming and sort of explain interfaces. The power of interfaces that they define a contract, and the contract allows you to simply call a method without having to test for that method. Of course, there's nothing wrong with testing for a method if you so desire, but the purpose of it is that not simply testing for a method name exists, but also definition. Unfortunately, with PHP 5 and below PHP 7, you can't really set the type hint on the return types. And even if you did, it's not... well, I mean, PHP is not strong typed for the most part. So you can say, for argument, accept a interface, and that would throw a catchable error, which potentially could allow execution to continue, but most part it would not. So the power of interfaces kind of needs to be explained better in a separate presentation and further. So trying to explain interfaces and how to use them would be in and of itself probably a 40-minute talk, going into code examples. So I'm not going to go too in depth, but you want to use interfaces as well as within functions and classes. So your classes would implement the interfaces, but you don't, so I think certain people have this idea that if you go object-oriented programming, you have to go all in with object-oriented programming, whereas that's not the case. If you want to, sometimes it's better just to create a function and then use that function. And if you're doing that, it's better to specify or type hint a interface and then pass in an object that satisfies that interface. Procedural code is okay with like creating a factory or modifying classes, or specifically modifying an interface, calling methods on a class that satisfies the interface. So procedural code is often simpler to a novice, whereas objects, they could have quite a bit of methods that hopefully could be called independently, but sometimes you have objects that, or classes that need to be called in a specific order, which sort of violates the whole principle of object-oriented programming. But it does exist. Those do exist where you have to call methods in a particular order, and there's setup and there's tear down, clean up, or whatever. So classes have any number of flaws, or hopefully it's done right. So, I mean, you can misuse procedural code and object-oriented code just as much. So, I don't. Well, I do understand the idea. It's like you go all in with object-oriented. You start it and you're told procedural code is evil. Never use procedural, but procedural code is often simpler. Um, but you do want to use objects, given that it does remove a lot of the dependencies on globals. And if you have different functions, or if you would have had multiple functions with the same parameters, multiple parameters that would be the same, it's probably better to create an object and pull those parameters out, make them properties or attributes, and then have methods that just have unique parameters, very short parameter list. That way, it's a lot cleaner. You can still have the functions, but the functions would potentially either take the interface or take the object and call those methods. So, which I mean, that's sort of how procedural code is supposed to be coded. But anyway, so in my opinion, it doesn't make sense to reject procedural code, especially given that once you go into functional paradigm, you'll be creating functions and doing it correctly. So the procedural paradigm is okay in that it's the basis of object-oriented programming. But you should be doing procedural and object-oriented programming like we should be following the idioms of functional paradigm, is what I'm trying to say. But mixing all of them is more powerful and gives you a more diverse powerful API than simply going with object-oriented API or procedural API. Of course, functional API would just, be best anyway. So to go into the code at this point, to explain the interfaces and the changes to the original. So yeah, I created a multiple interfaces for interface segregation. The main MyMetaBox interface only has register, which, as you can read the comment, registers the MetaBox, as well as a form display interface that has the form name as well as the display of the form. And the form name is really for when you save it to get the form name that's supposed to be pulled out and displayed. And a video display is the front end, as well as the verification of whether or not it should be saved, as well as the update MetaBox and delete MetaBox, which is part of CRUD. And then my MetaBox implements all of the interfaces and simply takes the code that was in the functions of the original plugin and puts it into an object. And then below I have a registry where the default is defined, but you can override with your class that implements the interface. So I can have a second plugin that calls my MetaBox video display instance with my class that implements my MetaBox video display interface, and I can replace the original plugin's video display on the front end, and I don't have to implement any of the other methods, nor do I have to extend. So with this, you can just make this final. I cannot extend this class, and you shouldn't be able to extend that class, which creates, you're telling developers they have to create their own class. So this might not look that clean. So down here, of course, I replace all the functions. I still keep IOR, but just simply replacing all of them. So when that's called, by default, the current plugin implementation is going to be used. In my plugin, use my class, use my implementation. So right here, you have this as well. Of course, the problem I think with some of this is that the one interface. So you should only have, well, I mean, this potentially could be gone. And this would be a display. And then you would simply register one for the admin and one for the front end. The second part is using a registry objects, and instead of using functions, using registry. Interfaces are the same. For the most part, the my meta box is the same. Since I'm using my meta box storage and registering all of the instances, all of the implementations for all of the interfaces, as well as calling storage for all the functions. So it's pretty much the same code. One class as opposed to multiple. And the nice thing about this is that I only need to call its register and pass my object to that, and it will go in and your registry implementation should allow for the instance to implement multiple places and replace the current implementation. So that really should be let me just fix this. To better demonstrate. Would potentially allow for multiple plugins to hook into the extension point and modify. And content is it's a little bit more tricky, depending on what we want to do. But in this instance, I think with the meta, only really wants to have one instance. So the goal is that like I can create a second plugin that changes the register, changes the form display. I can keep most of my code in the base plugin and have as little code as possible in the second, third, whatever the plugin, and then combine them into a coherent implementation based on my needs. And that's really the goal of using interfaces. Your additional code is a lot less than the original. So you are creating a lot more code, but the end result should be that ultimately you're creating less over time by reusing interfaces and only coding what is needed for the implementation. And that is the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, just leave a comment.